The heavy crystal chandelier above the dining table hummed with a quiet, expensive vibration, casting long, sharp shadows across the faces of my family. For 3 hours, they had been passing around a single piece of heavy white paper, like a piece of meat. I sat at the head of the table, perfectly still, my fingers lightly resting against the cold silver rim of my coffee cup. Opposite me sat my mother, Evelyn, her eyes sharp and predatory as she adjusted her heavy pearl necklace. Beside her was my older brother, Richard, leaning back in his velvet chair with an arrogant, self-satisfied grin that made my blood run cold. "Just sign the property allocation amendment, Clara," Richard said, his voice dropping into a smooth, practiced tone that he usually reserved for his wealthy real estate clients. "You're a single woman with a small design studio. You don't have the background, the corporate presence, or the stamina to manage a sprawling multi-million-dollar real estate estate like Oak Ridge Manor. Dad was heavily medicated when he wrote that final codicil. The family believes it's only fair that I take over the master title, liquidate the physical structures, and distribute a small monthly allowance to you." I looked around the table, a heavy, suffocating wave of pure betrayal washing over my chest. These were the people who shared my DNA. These were the people I had supported financially for 5 long years after our father fell ill. While Richard was out crashing luxury sports cars and running up massive debts at high-stakes country club casinos, I was sleeping on a cot in my father's hospice room, tracking his medical logs, managing his corporate tax filings, and single-handedly running his commercial properties to prevent bankruptcy. Now, my father had been gone for exactly 6 days, and the grief was still a raw, open wound in my chest. Yet here they were, sitting in his favorite room, drinking his expensive wine, and demanding that I hand over 90% of the inheritance he had explicitly left to me. "And if I refuse to sign this allocation, Richard?" I asked, my voice incredibly quiet, forcing the trembling panic out of my voice. "Then we will break you, Clara," my mother chimed in, her voice cold as ice. She slid a thick, black leather folder toward me across the polished mahogany wood. "Richard has already secured signed affidavits from Dad's primary care nurses, stating that his mind was completely gone during his final months. We have filed a formal emergency petition with the probate court to have your executor status revoked due to financial incompetence. If you don't walk out of here quietly with the cash settlement we offered, we will drag your name through the mud, shut down your design studio with endless lawsuits, and leave you with absolutely nothing." I looked down at the forged medical reports inside the folder. My hands shook slightly, but not from fear. It was from a deep, sudden, and dangerous wave of absolute clarity. They thought I was just a quiet, grieving girl who would crumble under the weight of their intimidation. They believed they had executed the perfect, flawless ambush. What Richard and my mother didn't know, what their expensive family lawyers hadn't even factored into their strategy, was that 3 weeks ago, sensing their growing greed, my father and I had sat down with a high-level corporate defense attorney to build an unbreakable legal fortress. I stood up slowly, leaving the black folder completely untouched. I looked at their smirking faces one last time, turned around, and walked out into the dark night. The trap was officially set, and my toxic family was about to walk straight into the light. To truly understand how a mother and a brother could look me in the eye and try to leave me penniless on the street, you have to look at the foundation of the Miller family structure. Our father, Charles Miller, was a brilliant, self-made real estate tycoon who built Oak Ridge Enterprises from a single rented office building into a $15 million commercial real estate empire. He was a man of intense discipline, rough-edged, but fundamentally fair. But from the time we were children, the rules in our household were vastly different for Richard and me. Richard was the firstborn, the golden prince. He possessed a natural, effortless charm that could talk anyone into anything. My mother absolutely worshipped him. Whenever Richard stole money from my father's wallet, failed his business classes, or ruined an expensive piece of company machinery, my mother would quickly step in, hide the evidence, and tell my father, "Oh, he's just a growing boy with a big personality." I, on the other hand, was the ghost in the hallway. I inherited my father's quiet obsession with details, organizational precision, and hard work. While Richard was attending high society parties, spending thousands on designer clothes, and networking at exclusive golf clubs, I spent my teenage summers sitting in my dad's dusty home office, learning how to calculate property depreciation, optimize commercial rental leases, and manage corporate tax compliance. "Clara, your brother knows how to shake hands and wear a beautiful suit," my father would often tell me on those late-night office sessions, his eyes fixed on the heavy ledger sheets. "But he doesn't understand the sweat it takes to hold a foundation together. A building can look magnificent on the outside, but without solid structural pillars, it's just a pile of bricks waiting for a storm. You are the pillar of this family, Clara. Never forget that." I took those words to heart. When I graduated from university with a degree in commercial architecture and business design, I didn't ask for a high-paying executive role or a massive salary from my dad's company. I launched my own independent boutique interior design firm, Aura Spaces, working 80-hour weeks out of a tiny rented studio apartment to prove my worth without using my father's name. Meanwhile, Richard was given the title of Senior Managing Director of Acquisitions at Oak Ridge Enterprises, a high-paying corporate position my mother pressured my father to create just to fund Richard's lavish lifestyle. Richard's daily routine consisted of driving a company-funded luxury car to 3-hour lunches, entertaining potential investors who never actually spent a single dollar, and showing up to the office at 3 p.m. just to sign his name on corporate checks that the accounting team had already prepared. The true crack in our family structure appeared 2 years ago, when my father was diagnosed with a severe, aggressive neurological illness that left him physically weak and confined to a wheelchair. With Dad unable to physically oversee the daily commercial operations of Oak Ridge Enterprises, my mother immediately used her power of attorney status to place Richard in complete financial control of the master accounts. Within 6 months, the empire my father had spent 40 years building began to rapidly bleed capital. I started noticing strange things when I visited my dad at the family manor. The property maintenance crews weren't being paid. Our long-term commercial tenants downtown were complaining about neglected structural repairs, and the company's main operational reserves were mysteriously dry. One rainy afternoon, while my father was sleeping under the care of his private nurse, I walked into his home study to retrieve his historical tax archives. As I opened the master filing cabinet, I found a hidden folder containing 3 months of redline bank notifications that had been hidden from my father. My heart stopped as my eyes scanned the transaction histories. Richard hadn't just been sloppy. He had been systematically siphoning millions of dollars from the Oak Ridge corporate accounts to cover his personal liabilities. He had lost nearly $800,000 at a high-stakes private casino downtown, and to cover his tracks, he had taken out high-interest hard money loans against 3 of our family's primary commercial buildings, using a forged copy of my father's corporate signature. "What are you doing in here, Clara?" a cold, sharp voice demanded from the doorway. I spun around to see Richard standing there, his face flushed with anger, holding a glass of scotch in his trembling hand. My mother stood right behind him, her arms crossed, looking at me with absolute contempt. "Richard, you are destroying Dad's company," I shouted, holding up the redline bank notices. "You took out millions in fraudulent loans against our master properties to cover your personal gambling debts. If the banks call these loans, Oak Ridge Enterprises will face absolute liquidation." "Watch your tongue, Clara," my mother snapped, stepping forward and snatching the papers out of my hand. "Your brother is managing a high-level corporate transition. He doesn't need a lifestyle designer telling him how to run a real estate firm. Those loans were authorized to expand our market presence. You don't know anything about high-finance corporate structures." "Dad didn't sign these, Mother," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "This signature is a digital forgery. I'm going to show these to Dad's corporate attorney downtown tomorrow morning." "You won't show anything to anyone," Richard said, stepping into my space, his smooth charm completely gone, replaced by a venomous, arrogant snicker. "Dad is heavily medicated on neurological painkillers, Clara. His memory is completely shot. If you try to make a scene or stress him out with this, the doctor says his heart won't take it. If you kill him with stress, I will ensure the entire world knows it was your fault. Just stick to your fabric swatches and stay away from my business." That evening, I walked into my father's bedroom. He looked so frail lying under the white sheets, but when he opened his eyes and saw me, a sudden, sharp look of absolute awareness filled his gaze. He reached out his thin, calloused hand and gripped my fingers with a surprising, intense strength. "Clara, they think I don't know," my father whispered, his voice sounding incredibly weak but completely steady. "I've seen the corporate logs on my tablet. Richard is hollowing out the firm, and your mother is helping him hide it. They are waiting for me to pass away so they can liquidate everything, take the cash, and leave you with nothing. But I built this foundation, Clara, and a miller always secures the pillars before the storm hits." The next day, my father didn't call his standard family lawyer, Mr. Vance, who was a close personal friend of my mother's. Instead, using his private satellite phone that Richard didn't know about, he called a legendary, ruthless corporate asset protection attorney named Mr. Henderson. Mr. Henderson arrived at the manor at midnight, dressed in a quiet, dark coat, carrying a secure digital scanner inside his leather briefcase. I met him at the side gate, ensuring the private nurses, who were being paid extra by Richard, were completely asleep. For 4 straight hours inside my father's bedroom, we executed an absolute masterwork of legal engineering. My father formally executed a comprehensive, ironclad corporate restatement titled the Miller Trust Protective Codicil. This document didn't just modify his will, it completely transformed the entire legal architecture of Oak Ridge Enterprises. The moment my father passed away, 90% of the company's voting shares, the master title to Oak Ridge Manor, and absolute sole executor authority were legally transferred directly into a private, blind trust managed exclusively by me. But the true genius of the document lay in its hidden trap clauses. My father explicitly left Richard a tiny, specific, conditional inheritance, a one-time payout of $50,000, but with a massive Catch-22 legal trigger. If Richard or my mother attempted to contest the will, file an incompetence petition, or manipulate any corporate assets, a specialized no-contest spoliation clause would instantly activate. This clause would completely strip them of their cash payout, trigger an automated independent forensic audit of the last 3 years of corporate books, and automatically hand over all records of Richard's forged loan applications directly to the Federal Financial Fraud Division. "They are going to try to ambush you the moment I'm gone, Clara," my father whispered, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across his pale face as he signed his bold, clear name at the bottom of the parchment. "They think they are the wolves, but they are just scavengers. Let them play their game. Let them spend their money on expensive lawyers. Let them forge their affidavits, and let them walk straight into the courtroom. Do not reveal this trust until the final probate clearance hearing. Let the trap spring when they think they have already won." My father passed away peacefully 3 weeks later on a quiet Sunday morning. The grief felt like a concrete block crushing my soul. I spent the first week in a complete state of emotional exhaustion, handling the funeral arrangements, answering thousands of messages from our tenants, and enduring the icy, mocking glances from Richard and my mother during the burial service. The very night after the funeral, they called the mandatory dining room meeting, sliding that fraudulent allocation contract across the table and threatening to ruin my life unless I surrendered my father's empire. I stood up, walked out of the house with my father's original trust documents locked inside my briefcase, and drove straight to Mr. Henderson's office downtown. The game was officially on, and my toxic family had no idea that their smooth corporate hands were already tied to the execution block. Thursday morning arrived with a blinding, fierce summer downpour that slammed against the massive granite pillars of the county probate court. The building was an ancient, high-ceilinged monument of polished marble and dark walnut paneling that felt thick with the absolute weight of legal history. Sitting at the petitioner's table on the right side of the center aisle was Richard. He looked completely immaculate, wearing a $3,000 custom-tailored charcoal suit, his gold Rolex watch catching the sharp fluorescent light as he casually adjusted his silk tie. Beside him sat my mother, looking equally arrogant in a designer black dress, her pearl necklace catching the light as she whispered smugly to their lead counsel, Mr. Bradley, a notoriously loud, aggressive trial lawyer known for destroying vulnerable heirs in probate disputes. When Mr. Henderson and I walked through the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom, Richard didn't even bother to stand. He simply let out a short, quiet snicker, leaning over to whisper something dismissive into my mother's ear. They truly believed I had shown up with a small-time estate attorney just to beg for a higher cash settlement before surrendering the company. At exactly 9:00 a.m., the side door opened, and Chief Probate Judge Margaret Sterling stepped onto the elevated marble bench. She was a legendary, sharp-witted woman with piercing gray eyes, a tight crown of silver hair, and a reputation for showing absolute zero tolerance for family greed or corporate manipulation. She slammed her heavy wooden gavel down, and the loud crack echoed through the silent room like a rifle shot. We are here today for the final probate clearance and executor verification of Case 712A, the estate of Charles Miller, Judge Sterling announced, her voice clear, mechanical, and entirely commanding. The petitioner, Richard Miller, has filed an emergency motion to revoke the historical executor status of Clara Miller, citing physical and mental incompetence of the decedent during the execution of the final estate updates. Mr. Bradley, you may present your petition. Mr. Bradley stood up smoothly, buttoning his pristine suit jacket as he stepped to the center podium with absolute, unshakable confidence. Thank you, Your Honor, Bradley began, his booming voice instantly filling the room with a practiced, dramatic tone of deep solemnity. This is a tragic, yet straightforward matter of protecting a grand family legacy from manipulation. The late Charles Miller was a magnificent businessman, but during his final 6 months, his neurological illness completely destroyed his cognitive functions. We have submitted to this court certified medical affidavits from his primary care nurses, stating that he was completely incapable of making financial decisions. Despite this, the respondent, Clara Miller, used her isolation with the decedent to force him to sign an alleged asset allocation that completely cuts out his loyal son and business partner, Richard. We ask this court to void all updates made in the final year, appoint Richard Miller as the sole executor, and protect Oak Ridge Enterprises from ruin today. Judge Sterling reviewed the thick stack of folders on her desk, her sharp eyes scanning the forged medical affidavits. She made a brief note with her pen before turning her cold, piercing gaze toward our table. Mr. Henderson, your client is facing an incredibly severe challenge from the estate's historical partners. Do you have any physical, verified documentation to dispute these medical reports? Because as it stands, the paperwork heavily favors the petitioner. Mr. Henderson stood up calmly, adjusting his glasses as he walked over to the center podium. He didn't bring a stack of folders. He brought nothing but a single sealed silver flash drive and a leather-bound folder. Your Honor, Henderson began, his deep voice carrying an immense, echoing authority that instantly made the room feel completely still. We are not here to dispute that my client's father was physically ill. We are here to demonstrate that the medical affidavits presented by Richard Miller are an absolute coordinated criminal forgery. We are asserting that the petitioner has spent the last 2 years systematically embezzling millions of dollars from his father's firm, and we are prepared to introduce the unfalsifiable master trust documents to prove it. Richard instantly stood up from his chair, his face twisting into a mask of theatrical, righteous outrage. That is an absolute lie, Your Honor. This is an insult to my father's memory. I have poured my life into Oak Ridge Enterprises. My sister is a lifestyle designer who is simply bitter because she doesn't understand high finance operations. Sit down, Mr. Miller, Judge Sterling snapped, her voice dropping into an icy warning register that made Richard instantly freeze and drop back into his seat. She turned her sharp gaze back to Henderson. Mr. Henderson, that is an incredibly severe allegation. To accuse an estate petitioner of manufacturing fake medical evidence and committing corporate fraud requires absolute, unshakable proof. Where is your evidence? We would like to call the petitioner himself, Richard Miller, to the witness stand to clarify his position under oath before we open the master file, Your Honor, Henderson said clearly, looking over at Richard with a cold, terrifying smile. Mr. Bradley leaned over, whispering quickly to Richard, before looking up at the judge. Your Honor, my client has absolutely nothing to hide. He is perfectly willing to clarify the integrity of his management under oath. Richard walked up to the elevated witness box, his posture confident, his head held high as he placed his hand on the legal Bible and swore to tell the absolute truth under penalty of perjury. He looked down at me from the box, his eyes flashing with a smug, triumphant look that clearly said, "You have nothing." Mr. Henderson walked slowly over to the witness stand, holding his hands behind his back. Mr. Miller, Henderson began softly. "You have stated to this court, through your counsel, that you conducted a thorough review of Oak Ridge Enterprises' finances over the last 2 years, and that every line of credit and loan taken out against the commercial properties was fully authorized by your late father. Is that correct?" "Yes, that's correct," Richard replied smoothly, his voice sounding perfectly practiced for the microphone. "And you swear, under oath today, that you never forged your father's digital signature on hard money loans to cover personal liabilities, and that you never paid financial bonuses to his primary care nurses to sign these medical incompetence affidavits?" Richard looked directly into the judge's eyes, his expression completely unwavering. "I swear it, completely. Every dollar I spent was for the growth of my father's company. These affidavits from the nurses are completely genuine. My father was entirely out of his mind when he talked about modifying his estate plans." "Thank you for that absolute clarity, Mr. Miller," Henderson said softly. He turned around, walked over to our table, and picked up the silver flash drive. "Your Honor, under Rule 613 regarding immediate impeachment evidence of a witness, I request permission to play an audiovisual file extracted from a secure digital monitoring system inside Charles Miller's master study, time-stamped exactly 5 days ago." Mr. Bradley exploded out of his chair, slamming his hands onto the oak table. "Objection, Your Honor. This is an unmapped, undiscovered electronic file. This is a blatant legal ambush. It is immediate verification of an absolute lie told 10 seconds ago under penalty of felony perjury, Counselor," Judge Sterling countered, her gray eyes narrowing into 2 sharp slits of steel as she looked down at the defensive lawyers. "Objection overruled. Open the file, Mr. Henderson." The courtroom lights automatically dimmed, and the massive projection screens on the walnut walls flashed to life with a brilliant, high-definition video feed. The image showed my father's master study, perfectly clear, illuminated by the warm desk lamp. Sitting at the desk was Richard, his charcoal jacket off, his sleeves rolled up as he held a thick stack of medical paperwork. Standing next to him was Nurse Sarah, my father's head private nurse, and my mother, Evelyn. The audio cut through the silent, crowded courtroom with a terrifying, crystal-clear resonance. "Is the nurse's signature fully notarized, Richard?" my mother's voice asked from the screen, her tone cold and businesslike. "I just transferred the final $20,000 to Sarah's offshore account," the video version of Richard replied with a short, arrogant chuckle as he slipped a pen into his pocket. "As long as she swears in her affidavit that Dad was completely delusional when he signed Clara's trust document, the judge will completely throw it out. Clara is a soft, emotional idiot. By next week, the manor will be liquidated. Oak Ridge Enterprises will be entirely mine, and she won't have enough capital left to pay her studio rent." On the screen, Richard could be seen clearly signing my father's name onto a series of corporate asset transfer logs, before flashing a smug, mocking wink at the camera lens he didn't realize was recording him. The video stopped. The courtroom fell into an absolute, suffocating silence, so deep you could hear the steady rhythm of the rain hitting the high glass windows outside. Richard's face in the witness box instantly turned a horrifying, ghostly shade of ash white. His mouth hung wide open, his hands gripping the wooden railing of the box so hard his knuckles turned completely translucent. He looked down at his own mother, but Evelyn had completely collapsed back into her chair, her face covered in a layer of cold sweat, her hands shaking so violently her pearl necklace snapped, sending small white beads bouncing loudly across the hardwood floor. Chief Probate Judge Margaret Sterling slowly rose from her high black marble bench. The expression on her face wasn't just anger. It was an immense, terrifying judicial fury that made the entire room feel like it was vibrating under an earthquake. She looked down at Richard from her elevated position, her eyes burning like twin coals of pure justice. "Mr. Miller," Judge Sterling said, her voice dropping into a low, deadly whisper that carried the immense, crushing weight of 30 years of legal authority. "You have stood in this federal courtroom, placed your hand on a sacred text, looked me in the eyes, and committed flagrant, deliberate perjury in a desperate attempt to commit multi-million-dollar grand larceny, extortion, and systemic fraud against your own sister. Your Honor, please, that video, it was taken out of context. It was a family dispute," Richard stammered, his smooth, elegant corporate voice completely breaking, turning into a high-pitched, pathetic whine as a heavy bead of sweat rolled down his cheek. "Silence!" Judge Sterling shouted, slamming her heavy wooden gavel down with a resounding crack that echoed through the room like a thunderbolt. "Do not dare to utter another dishonest word in my presence. I have heard more than enough from you. Step down from that box immediately." She turned her sharp, unyielding gaze toward the two armed court bailiffs standing by the double doors. "Bailiffs, take the petitioner, Richard Miller, into immediate administrative custody," Judge Sterling commanded, pointing her finger directly at my trembling brother. "He is to be held without bail pending a formal grand jury indictment for felony perjury, spoliation of evidence, corporate asset manipulation, and grand-scale estate fraud. Furthermore, Mr. Bradley, your client's petition is dismissed with absolute prejudice. I am forwarding this entire audiovisual file directly to the District Attorney's White-Collar Crime Division for immediate criminal prosecution of all parties involved, including the medical staff." The two burly county sheriffs walked quickly up the center aisle, their heavy boots clicking against the floorboards. Before Richard could even reach for his tailored charcoal jacket, they pulled his arms forcefully behind his back, and the sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs echoed through the silent space. He began to openly weep, his legs buckling beneath him as they dragged him out through the side door, his head down, his expensive leather shoes scraping pathetically against the floorboards as he was marched straight to a jail cell. But the legal trap my father and I had built didn't stop at Richard's arrest. Mr. Henderson stepped back to the center podium, holding up the certified master copy of the Miller Trust Protective Codicil. "Your Honor," Henderson announced clearly, his voice echoing through the stunned courtroom. "Under the statutory trigger clauses of the valid Miller Trust, because the petitioner attempted to fraudulently contest the decedent's wishes and manufacture false evidence, the specialized no-contest spoliation clause has been officially activated. This legally strips Richard Miller and Evelyn Miller of every single dollar of their conditional inheritance, revokes their corporate shares, and vests 100% of Oak Ridge Enterprises and Oak Ridge Manor solely in the name of Clara Miller." My mother, Evelyn, stood up from her chair, her face completely distorted with absolute terror and rage. "You can't do this. I am his wife. I built that life with him. Clara, you selfish little snake, look at what you've done to this family." "Madam, sit down," Judge Sterling roared, pointing her gavel directly at my shaking mother. "Your actions on that video constitute an explicit criminal conspiracy to manufacture false evidence and defraud an estate. If you speak one more word in this room, I will have the bailiffs place you in a cell right next to your son. Your historical power of attorney is completely void. You have zero legal right to this estate, zero right to the corporate funds, and you are hereby ordered to vacate Oak Ridge Manor within 24 hours. Step out of my courtroom immediately." My mother slowly sank back into her seat, completely broken, realizing that her golden prince was going to prison. Her luxury lifestyle was entirely gone, and the quiet daughter she had spent 30 years ignoring was now the absolute ruler of the family empire. I sat at my table, a profound, overwhelming sense of relief washing over my chest as tears finally blurred my vision. For 5 long years, I had suffered their insults, their isolation, and their greed in silence. I had watched them bleed my father's strength and treat his life's work like a playground for their personal vanity. Now, in the span of 15 minutes, my father's brilliant legal architecture had completely smashed their illusions, leaving them with nothing but the cold reality of their own crimes. The storm of the legal battle cleared within 2 weeks, with Richard sitting in a secure county correctional facility awaiting his formal criminal trial, and my mother officially living in a small, rented apartment on the edge of the city, funded by her own dwindling personal accounts. The corporate restructuring of Oak Ridge Enterprises moved with an incredible, unbending speed. Under the statutory emergency clauses of the court order, the corporate registry was completely cleansed. Every single hard money loan Richard had fraudulently taken out using forged signatures was legally declared null and void under the Federal Corporate Fraud Protection Acts, and the bank liabilities were shifted entirely onto Richard's personal assets. The morning after the final executive transition was certified, I drove back to the master corporate headquarters of Oak Ridge Enterprises. When my car pulled up to the main security gate, the guard, A man named Marcus, who had worked for my father for 15 years, looked at me, a massive, brilliant smile spreading across his face. He didn't look at a clipboard or ask for a corporate badge. He instantly pressed the button, and the heavy iron gate swung wide open to welcome me home. As I walked through the front doors of the executive office suite, the entire staff, the property managers, the accountants, the data analysts, and the maintenance supervisors, were all standing in the main hallway. The moment I stepped inside, they broke into a loud, roaring applause that filled the entire building. They weren't clapping for a flashy corporate salesman in a gold watch. They were welcoming the real engine back to the drafting table. I walked into my father's old master office, opened the heavy velvet curtains, and looked out the window at the beautiful commercial towers rising against the city skyline. I sat down in his heavy leather chair, placed his old drafting tools on the center of the desk, and took a deep, quiet breath of absolute peace. The empire was safe, the tenants were protected, and the foundation was completely solid. As I watched the sun set over the city buildings today, a profound, quiet reflection settles into my soul. Our modern corporate world often celebrates the showmen, the smooth talkers, and the arrogant individuals who spend their lives looking for shortcuts, taking credit for work they never performed, and trampling over the loyal people who actually carry the weight of the labor in the shadows. They believe that an expensive suit, a charming smile, and a willingness to betray their own flesh and blood can rewrite reality. But this long, painful journey taught me the ultimate moral lesson of human life. A company, a family, and a legacy cannot be sustained by empty words, forged papers, and systemic greed. True success and enduring wealth aren't found in the cash you can grab through deception. They are built on the unshakable foundation of character, honesty, sweat, and integrity. My father knew that a beautiful building is completely worthless if its structural pillars are dishonest. Richard and my mother tried to erase my hard work and leave me with nothing. But in their blind arrogance, they forgot that you can never truly destroy the truth. When you stand on the side of honesty, fairness, and dedicated labor, the elaborate webs of the deceptive will always unravel under the light of absolute justice. And when the smoke of the battle finally clears, the greedy are left with nothing but their empty cell walls and broken pearls, while the quiet workers inherit the magnificent kingdoms they built with their own two hands.